I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and I am speaking with Sara Dosa, the director of the documentary Fire of Love, as part of our Meet the Experts panel on film documentaries. This documentary centers on Katya and Maurice Kraft, who were this married couple that studied volcanoes throughout their life. And Sara, the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what kind of lasting impacts have Katya and Maurice had on our basic understanding of volcanoes and how they work?
Katya and Maurice Kraft are legends, not just for the life that they lived, but for the science that they contributed as well. The two of them were coming of age in the late 60s and were on the vanguard of the field of volcanology itself. And we're part of a movement of scientists who are extremely active and curious about working in the field. Katya and Maurice particularly dared to get so close to erupting volcanoes that had been so poorly understood by scientists in the past. They're so dangerous and often so remote, but their absolute passion for volcanoes, and also, of course, for each other and the adventure of being close to a volcano together, allowed them to conduct incredible scientific research, but most notably capture the imagery that set this fleeting kind of phenomena of volcanic activity to posterity through the camera. So their cinematography, which is just so beautiful, is simultaneously scientific data. And that's been so valuable for building the field of volcanology and earth sciences itself. Katya in particular, as a woman in the field, battled tremendous sexism to be this pioneering figure. And so she has her own legacy of inspiring so many other women to see that it's possible. So I think that her legacy on the field is particularly meaningful. The other thing too, their work was, especially towards the end of their life, was incredibly important in kind of implementing systems that would allow people to evacuate dangerous areas before volcanic eruptions actually, began. I think it's very fair to say that their work saved thousands and thousands of lives and continues to be used as kind of a standard of how to think about communicating with the public about listening to scientists and thinking about what a natural disaster means.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Katya, being a woman in the scientific field, having to overcome so much sexism. Was that additionally compounded by the fact that she was working with her husband, and would like a lot of other scientists just like sort of defer to her husband by default, and she had to also escape that shadow as well?
That's a great question. And yes, that was something that she encountered all the time, and something that really showed up in the footage too. There's one very memorable clip that just drove everyone on our team crazy. It was a roundtable scientific discussion on French television, where the host introduces Maurice saying, "And here with us today is Maurice Kraft, world-renowned volcanologist and adventurer," and his wife, Katya. And you could just see Katya's jaw tightening. And I know so many women have that experience too, where the man is thought of as the lead or the one in charge, when Katya herself had seen more erupting volcanoes and studied them even more so than Maurice. And Maurice would often kind of correct them and say, "Oh, it's actually a problem in our relationship. Katya's cheating on me with volcanoes. She's seen even more volcanoes than I have." So they would learn how to kind of diffuse the moment and be playful and redirect. And but Katya had to endure so much. And I think that's part of why she often, she loved volcanoes for volcanoes themselves, but the two of them really wrestled with the disillusionment of being in kind of human society for big parts of their life. And I think that was part of it for Katya as well.
So you mentioned, they had all this footage. They recorded all of this. How much footage was there to go through in compiling together what would end up being, this little more than an hour and a half movie?
Yeah, for us, we were working with about 250 hours of archival imagery. About 200 hours of that was the 16 millimeter footage that Katya and Maurice shot, including thousands of still photographs that Katya took. And then there's about 50 hours of archival footage that was of Katya and Maurice on showing up on other people's cameras. For example, documentaries in the 80s and 90s, and then later 90s after the death about them, as well as, they're featured on a lot of fun French variety shows of the 70s. And they were also regular guests. Whenever an eruption would happen, they were often brought in to explain kind of the science of what was happening and also tell people, this is how you evacuate. So that's kind of like the main kind of buckets of footage that we're working with. I should say that the 16mm footage that they shot, though, had no sync sound. So most of the footage we worked with had no sound. And that was at first incredibly challenging to work with, but then turned into a really inspiring opportunity for us as a team to figure out how to build in soundscapes, particularly bringing out the character of the volcano through our sonic landscape.
How easy is it to get lost in footage of rivers of lava and magma?
I could talk to you for hours about that. It is incredibly easy. A lot of our film, or I'd say a main theme of our film, is about time, kind of human time, the fleeting nature of human life against kind of the geologic enormity of a near or immortal volcano. And I would say that there's something about looking at lava that totally loses you into this expansive time. Hours
it feels therapeutic, doesn't it?
It really is. Yeah, there's something so cathartic about watching it. It's, you're seeing the forces of creation and destruction, and it's mesmerizing and hypnotic and inspires awe and a sense of contemplation about your place in the universe all at once. But I was embarrassed. My first round of notes for my editors, my spreadsheet was just this shot is incredible. You have to use this. And then this shot is incredible. Use this one. Oh no, this one. And so it was very easy to get lost and caught up in just the beguiling beauty of it all.
I'm curious if there was any aspect of either of them as people or as scientists that you wished you could have addressed in the film, but for whatever reason, maybe you didn't have proper footage to go along with it, you just weren't able to?
That's a great question. There's so many things because their legacy is so expansive, and complex, that there's all kinds of things we would have loved to have addressed or to have asked them to, if we were able to communicate, one-on-one directly with them. But yeah, I think we tried to embrace kind of the unknowns as part of our storytelling, actually. For example, we didn't have footage of the beginning of their relationship until 1970, really, because they started working with cameras after that. And so we had to figure out how to address those holes in some sort of creative way, and kind of guided by this idea of a collage film that was supposed to have, faint resonance with kind of geologic sediment, so to speak, bringing these various layers together to create this whole. We drew upon inspiration, or we drew upon animation that was inspired by the many volcanic illustrations that they collected, as well as found footage to kind of tell that story. But we had to admit in our storytelling that Katya and Maurice passed away 30 years ago, and pieces of their story had been lost to time. And kind of that admission of the unknowns and the mystery of their own story, we hope in some way could kind of resonate with the mysteries that Katya and Maurice themselves sought regarding that of volcanoes. So much of their quest is about the unknown. And for us too, as filmmakers, we had to really embrace that and sit with it ourselves too.
It's interesting you brought up the animation, and I absolutely loved the animation that was used in the movie. I was curious, what led you to say, let's use animation to convey some of this, and also what led to that specific type of animation? Because it's almost kind of like stop motion looking. It's very intricate.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the animation and similar to our narration and I'd say most of our stylistic choices for the film were generated through the challenges that we encountered. And again, the footage that they shot, it was so spectacular, but it was so limited. And we did think that if we were going to tell a love story, which was so important to us to tell, I should maybe back up and say that idea of a love story was generated by Katya and Maurice themselves. And particularly there's a sentence in a book that Maurice wrote where he says, For me, Katya and volcanoes, it is a love story. And that's now actually a line that comes in at the very end of our film. But it was really a genesis point where we felt like Maurice was handing us kind of a thesis statement on how to interpret their legacy. So we really wanted to embrace that as the heart of our film. But we had a lot of limitations because there's no imagery of, say, Katya and Maurice kissing or holding hands or out on a date or any of the conventional imagery one would associate with a love story. So we had to devise these different techniques that still felt very true to them in order to tell that story. And we thought that whimsical animation that was inspired by their many collected illustrations of volcanoes, like such as, these that are directly above me. These come from an illustrator named Levi Yagi. And Katya and Maurice often used his work and their own books. But we thought that style that is at once kind of whimsical yet scientific, nearly psychedelic, could feel of their playful spirit. And also the specific reason why we went to kind of this paper cutout style was to situate the readers in the beginning of their courtship, which took place really in libraries. They were together dreaming of getting out into the field, but they weren't able to do so because just yet they were studying, trying to, hungrily absorb everything they could about the existing archives of the earth before they could go to create their own archives of the earth, so to speak. And we were so lucky to work with a brilliant paper cutout animator, Lucy Munger, as our lead animator for creating that paper world.
Well, Sara, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our panel in just a little bit.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Really appreciate the conversation.
I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and I am speaking with Matthew Heineman, the director of Retrograde, as part of our film documentary panels for Meet the Experts. First question I wanted to ask you about this is, when you watch this documentary, there's so much that is so that's so evident that you went through in making this. What are some of the most lasting memories, positive or negative, that you have from your time shooting this documentary?
It was a harrowing film to make, and definitely the hardest film that I've made thus far in my career, emotionally, physically, logistically. I'm not sure there's a lot of happy moments in the film. It was somewhat of a slow motion train wreck that we were filming over the course of these 8 months, and honestly, one of the saddest sort of stories that I've ever filmed, because at some point it became a fait accompli that this was all going to fall apart, and that the Afghan army was going to lose to the Taliban. So obviously there's camaraderie amongst our crew, and moments of levity amongst the darkness, both amongst our crew and with participants that we were filming with. But it was definitely a very harrowing and sad film to make.
So I think one of the things that's so that's so impressive about this is how are you able to get access to these high level military personnel at such a dangerous time for them?
So the film documents the final 8 months of the longest war in U.S. history, first from the perspective of the U.S. Army Green Berets, and then once President Biden pulled out our troops, we pivoted the film and ended up embedding with an Afghan general, General Sami Sadat, whom they were working with, and followed him until the final days of the end of the war. And from the Green Beret perspective, it took several years to gain their trust, to get permission to actually embed with them. They're a very closed, insular community, and yeah, it took years, and then COVID happened, so it took a very, very long time to actually get on that embed. And then, with General Sadat in the Afghan side of things, I think the trust that we built with the Green Berets sort of carried over with him. He felt like if they trusted us, he should trust us. But obviously, we had to gain his trust individually as well. And so that took some convincing, but eventually it worked out.
Of course, one of the most harrowing parts of this documentary is, of course, towards the end with that, with, we saw, here in America, we saw the pictures and some of the videos of what was happening at Kabul airport. But then to see it from your perspective, and it was so much more raw and gave it this whole new level of context to it. And what I'm curious about though is, was there a sense going into that it was going to be as chaotic as it was, or was there something where you said, where you saw something and you were like, this is going to be on a whole other level of absolute insanity?
No, I mean, there's a million moments in this film where the perspective of the storytelling shifted or changed. I've said this throughout my career, and I keep saying because it happens to be true. When I was 21 years old, I heard Al Maisel speak, and he said, if you end up with the story you started with, then you weren't listening along the way, which, is good advice for life. It's good advice for filmmaking. Don't be dogmatic, be open to the story changing. And certainly was the case with Retrograde. In mid-August, we were planning on going back to film with General Sadat, what we thought would be sort of the final showdown with the Taliban. And by the time we got to Kabul, by the time we got to Dubai to fly to Kabul, things started to fall quite rapidly. And then we got on a flight to Kabul. And as we descended into the valley, the pilot got on the intercom and said, we can't land, there's a plane on the tarmac. We were so low that all of our phones started to ping and ping and ping and ping. And we got these news alerts that the Taliban had taken over the city and in essence, the country, and that the plane on the tarmac was actually President Ghani fleeing. And so we were forced to go back to Dubai. And I just felt like it was the greatest failure of my entire career. We'd spent 8 months building this story to this moment, this tragic, historic moment. And we were watching it play, go down on a hotel TV screen in an airport hundreds of miles away. And so basically spent every waking hour after that trying to figure out how to sneak back into the country, which we did 4 or 5 days later. But by that time, General Sadat, our main subject, had been forced to flee. So again, we were forced with this question: what is this story we're telling? I'm not the news. I don't work for the BBC or CNN. I have no utility being there. I have no news report to file. And so, with every failure comes an opportunity. With every door that closes, a door opens. And what this did for us was allow us to open up the metaphorical aperture of the storytelling, to see the civilians that the Green Berets have been fighting for, to see the civilians that General Sadat had been fighting for, and really humanize this tragic, horrible final chapter of this war and the desperate exodus of the civilians, many of whom had worked with the U.S. over these past 2 decades, who knew what their fate and what the future held, as they desperately tried to flee.
Do you find it difficult to be, this might not be the right word to use, and feel free to criticize me if it's not the right word to use, but do you find it difficult to be, objective about the material that you're filming when you are confronted by so much just emotion and tragedy as you're trying to film?
I think most of what I do is quite instinctual. I'm not cerebralizing, if that's a word, objectivity or subjectivity. I think anyone who pretends that they're making a documentary in an objective way is, telling falsehoods. Anytime you turn on the camera, anytime you change lenses, and anytime you push a button in the edit room, you're injecting subjectivity into the process. And so, I don't pretend that I'm doing anything objective. It's a subjective. Art is subjective. Making movies is subjective. Making documentaries is subjective. And that being said, you try to, at least I try to, get to an emotional truth of the moment, of the scene, of the day, or whatever it may be. And I think it's something I say all the time in the edit room, is let the audience feel what it felt like to be there. Let's let the audience feel what it felt like to be in a helicopter being shot at by the Taliban, in a, meeting, as General Sadat is trying to confront the Taliban surrounding them, what it's like to be like at the airport. What did it feel like? What did the wind feel like? What did it smell like? So, as you start to think about those questions, you really try to put people in the shoes of your participants, and in doing so, hopefully creating, a little bit more of an empathetic connection with these issues that feel so distant and feel so far away, and allow audiences to sort of think about, what if that was me, or what if that's my cousin or my brother or my sister, and again, making them not feel so distant.
Do you believe that there's any hope for the for the Afghan people with their current situation under the Taliban, or is it just kind of just sort of stuck there?
I get the hope question all the time. I think it's human nature to try to want to find hope in darkness, but I don't have a lot of hope right now, to be honest. I mean, the film is titled Retrograde. Retrograde is a military term for leaving a war zone. Obviously, retrograde also means many things. It means moving backwards, and we are where we started when the Twin Towers fell 20 years ago. Girls can't go to school. Women can't go outside without their faces covered. All the sort of human rights advances that happened over the past 2 decades have been eradicated. The economy is in free fall. Foreign aid is shrunken with the Taliban in charge, and it's a desperate time for the people of Afghanistan. And so it's terribly, terribly, terribly sad. So I don't find hope necessarily in the reality of what's happening there. I find hope in individual people, and the fortitude of the Afghan people to persevere despite really being at war for a very long time. I mean, this war preceded, there was fighting long before the US invaded. So the Afghan people are quite hardened to the realities of war, and, are quite strong. And so I have faith that out of this will come something positive. I just can't say what that is at this point.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our panel in just a little bit.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and I am joined by Alex Pritz, the director of The Territory, as part of our Meet the Experts film documentary panel. The first question I wanted to ask was, you filmed this, since you completed filming this, there was another election in Brazil. Bolsonaro is now out of power. Former President Lula is just sworn in the last couple of weeks. How hopeful are the Uru'e people with the new Lula administration that's just come into power?
Yeah, it's a huge shift. It's a tone shift across the country, I think. And it was one of our goals, really, that the film tracks the effects of the Bolsonaro administration on these frontline communities. And while it's not, an overtly political film, you see the effects of Bolsonaro's policies and of his political speech on these people, and how that is converted into violence really quickly. And so you see his inauguration happen on January 1st, 2019. And it was always a goal of ours to get the film out in Brazil before people went to the polls again for this next election. And so thankfully, we were able to have a theatrical release in Brazil just 3 weeks before people went to the polls. And then just last weekend, as you said, Bolsonaro was sworn out of office, and Lula, a former steel worker, union organizer, is back in as president, and he's made a lot of promises to Indigenous people. He's started a new Ministry of Indigenous Affairs led by an Indigenous woman. There's a record number of Indigenous women in Congress now for the first time. And so we're really looking to the future and looking for ways that we can support the Uru'e in building something better for the next. Yeah.
What was their experience like with government prior to Bolsonaro? Because as friendly as they might have been, I have a feeling that was there still like a lot of roughness that maybe with a former president coming back into power that that could have possibly made them apprehensive about this?
Yeah, it's naive to think that the problems that Indigenous people in Brazil face will go away with, a new administration. These are problems that they've been facing for generations, centuries, since the Portuguese first arrived as the original colonizers of Brazil. But Lula's been president before, and we've seen deforestation levels decrease under his previous administrations. There are quite good laws on paper in Brazil in terms of environmental protection. The thing we really saw over the past 4 years of Bolsonaro was the stripping away of any enforcement mechanisms for those laws. So the environmental police, the people that would have been going out and supporting Indigenous people, patrolling the land, arresting invaders, imposing environmental fines on people, all of that has been gutted. And so it's now up to the Lula administration both to rebuild those various agencies and to try to shift the tone of the country and help these frontier communities that have felt really emboldened to go out and seize, protected lands. Those people need to be brought back into the fold and given other ways of developing, agriculture that doesn't require new trees to be cut down.
So you kind of touched on this a little bit in the movie, but I was wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about what role has religion and specifically evangelical Christianity played in the destruction of these indigenous areas, because I've read some reports about how that has been another bit of the driving force behind this.
That is a great question, and one I don't get asked often enough. Thank you, Charlie. The rise of the evangelical church in Brazil has been really sharp over the past couple of decades, and we try to hint at it in several ways. It's apparent in the kind of iconography of a lot of people with, we've seen tractors that are bulldozing the Amazon with a big cross painted on them, and people are very visibly demonstrating that they see this as part of a long tradition of discovery. I think there's a doctrine of discovery that was put out by the Catholic Church. That's one of the things that a lot of Native and Indigenous groups in Brazil have been trying to fight against, this idea that land is somehow empty and blank until you come along and colonize it and bring the church into that land. And that's when it becomes a habitable place, a civilized place. And so the film definitely does touch on that. I think a lot of the ideas that drive these people into the forest and fuel the destruction of the rainforest were developed and refined in America as well. The idea of manifest destiny, the westward expansion and expropriation of native land here in the United States, and the ensuing violence against native groups and the genocide that really occurred here. That is a reference point for a lot of these people in Brazil. They look to America as a kind of ideological vanguard for their movement and their colonial project. And so manifest destiny, the divine right to the lands that these settlers feel they have, a lot of that is directly related to the colonial project here in America.
So, I feel like this is a very basic question, but I'm still curious. First of all, how did you manage to get in contact with the Urayawawa people, and how did you manage to gain their trust to just be able to be around them and film them?
Yeah, so for me, this project really began with Nadinha, the activist who you mentioned in the film. I had read about her work, felt incredibly inspired by her. She is this badass 60-year-old woman fighting tooth and nail against these massive forces, receiving nearly weekly death threats for her work. Her children had to be under armed federal police escorts to and from school and in elementary school. It's had a huge impact on her family and her whole life, fighting for the rainforest and indigenous rights. And then reached out to her when we saw the Bolsonaro campaign beginning to heat up and gaining momentum and the violent rhetoric that was coming out of that campaign. And so I flew to Brazil with a one-way plane ticket and a bit of an idea of what we might find there, but really just wanted to meet her and be with her through this pivotal moment as Bolsonaro was coming into power. Nadinia very quickly said, look, this story cannot be just about me. It needs to include the Uruguay, the defenders of the largest intact forest that's left in this part of the Amazon, a group of 150 indigenous people that are protecting an area of rainforest that's 2.5 times the size of the state of Delaware. It's massive. You can see it from outer space as this dark green island of forest surrounded by, brown, denuded, deforested farmland. And so through Nadinia and her, 40-year relationship with this community, I was able to enter, ask permission to explain the film that we were interested in embarking on. It was a long, patient process, I'll say. I can get more into it, but it took months and months of conversations before we really felt like we were ready to even start filming with the community in earnest. And then when COVID came, it moved from a sort of participatory framework that we had set up with the community into a full-on co-production where I wasn't able to enter their territory anymore. And the indigenous community picks up cameras and assumes responsibility of filming the last chapter of their own story.
One of the other things I'm also curious about is, when you hear, the idea of indigenous people in a rainforest, all sorts of ideas can come to people's heads. I'm sure even people in the country of Brazil. What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of Brazil's indigenous population, and specifically, if you know this, with the Brazilian people?
That's a great question too. Without speaking for indigenous people, I think it'd be great to hear Bitate's answer to this question. I can talk a little bit about either my own preconceived ideas that were really changed through the making of this film. One of the ideas, actually, though, that Bolsonaro really put forward strongly and has embedded itself in a lot of Brazilian people's understanding of indigenous people is Bolsonaro uses this term iPhone Indians, meaning, as a way to denigrate indigenous people and strip them of their identity. Meaning, if you engage with technology, if you have a cell phone, if you use an iPhone, you can no longer claim access to that your indigenous identity. And the flip side of that statement is, by Bolsonaro's definition, the only real indigenous people are isolated indigenous people living in the forest, and without who aren't really engaging in the Brazilian political processes. And so that's a really harmful idea. And I was really inspired by the young people in our film, Bitate, Chai Srui, our indigenous executive producer, who's 25, and their outright refusal of this false binary. They say, we are technologically advanced, we are media savvy and politically sophisticated, and we're in touch with our traditional culture, and we're using these tools to defend our land and our people. And I just thought that was a really, really inspiring and bold stance that they were able to take.
Yeah, I mean, that last part of the movie, I was just like, wow, he knows what he's doing with that stuff and how to do that.
Yeah. So Bitate, the 19-year-old leader of this indigenous community, uses technology. He gets drones and GPS and walkie-talkies and brings them into his community to advance his indigenous group's ability to surveil their land and catch these invaders, and then use that video as evidence to bring to the public prosecutor's office and say, no, look, you said you didn't believe me. Here's proof that these people are on our lands. Now go do something about it. And we've been really inspired by the fact that Bitate now, actually, he's in New York with me right now. We're doing some screenings here, but he got permission from his professors to take some time off because he's the first member of the Uruguay to go to university. And he just finished his first semester exams, and he's studying journalism. So, the project that this film has been a part of is continuing, and we're really excited to see where they take it next.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our panel in just a little bit.
See you soon. Thanks, Charlie.
I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and I am interviewing as part of our Meet the Experts film documentary panel, Sara Dosa, the director of Fire of Love, Matthew Heineman, the director of Retrograde, and Alex Pritz, the director of The Territory. The first question I wanted to ask you, this is big. You're all joining us because you all your films made the short list for the Oscar for Best Documentary Feature. So first of all, congratulations to all of you on that. And I wanted to know, what was your reaction to finding this information out. And I want to start with you, Sarah, because the day that we are recording this morning, you got an added amazing bit of news when you found out that you had made the BAFTA long list, not only for documentary, but for Best Director. Congratulations on that. What were these two? What was the finding out the Oscars and finding out about the BAFTAs? What was that like for you?
Well, thank you so much for those congratulations. I was thrilled, so profoundly honored. It was a wonderful surprise. This morning, the BAFTA was an additional surprise. But yeah, I just feel really grateful to be on this ride, and that more people are, going to meet Katya and Maurice's work, with the film getting more attention. But we work so hard as filmmakers, just so hard. I still, quite honestly, can't believe we even finished the film in time for Sundance last year. So anything extra just feels surreal, and really honored to be in the company of Matt and Alex and all the other filmmakers on the list.
And how about you, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, similar, probably. Just really, really humbled and honored, and it's been an incredible year for docs this year. And such a amazing array of filmmaking styles, and I think it just shows what a beautiful, malleable form documentaries are. And I think yeah, it just was. You just look at the range of films that were shortlisted. It's really incredibly impressive. So just humbled and honored to be part of that group. And I think it's hard enough to get these films seen. It just helps us, these small little films, to get more eyeballs. So that's great.
And how about you, Alex?
Yeah, we were flat out psyched. We were so excited. It was great news. It's been a year of festivals and great exposure for the film. Like Sarah, I think I was just so floored to get into Sundance. This is the first feature film I've directed. I've been lucky to shoot on some other amazing films, including Matt's beautiful film, The First Wave. And so for a first film of mine, it's been great.
So one of my favorite questions to ask on these panels, I love specifically for documentary filmmakers, I love finding out what were the influences or the things that made you first crack that egg of this is something I want to do. You saw something and you're like, yes, that's what I want to do. And so I'm wondering, what were the documentaries that had that effect on you? And I want to start with you, Matt.
Early on in my career, or in respect to Retrograde?
Just in general of going into documentary filmmaking.
Got it. I mean, going to documentary filmmaking was never part of my master plan. If I had a master plan, I studied history in college. I never took a film class, and I thought I wanted to be a teacher. I got rejected from Teacher America, which a lot of people asked. They didn't know that was possible, but I was one of the lucky ones who got rejected. And so three of my best friends and I hatched up this idea to drive around the US for 3 months. We raised some money, bought a video camera, and interviewed people from Mark Zuckerberg to drug dealers to cancer researchers, and did this kaleidoscopic journey across the US. And in doing so, just fell in love with filmmaking, and taught myself as I went. And I'll never forget, there's a moment that I had in New Orleans 3 months after Hurricane Katrina, where I walked into the 9th Ward with a man who saw his house for the first time after the hurricane. And just what a privilege and what an honor it was to be able to be there for such an intimate moment, and such an emotional moment. And I just remember sort of having this sort of almost out of body experience, and literally at that time I was like, I want to do this for the rest of my life. And that I guess is what I've done.
And what about you, Sarah?
For me, kind of similar to Matt, filmmaking was never actually in my plan growing up. I thought I was either going to be a professor of cultural anthropology, following in my mother's footsteps, because that's what she's now retired, but that's what she did, or a nonfiction writer. But my first week of college as an undergraduate, my university had a film series, and I happened to go, and I saw The Graduate, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, and Requiem for a Dream in 1 week. And I was just like,
wow,
what is this art form? I hadn't been exposed to cinema in the same way. before, and it really opened my eyes to the potential of the craft. And shortly after, I specifically got really excited about documentary kind of and how it brought together my interest in anthropology as well as writing. And a few documentaries particularly got me excited about that. One of them is Patricio Guzman's Nostalgia for the Light, which I thought was just such a transcendent and poetic meditation on Chilean history, bringing in his own personal voice as well as these incredible characters to illuminate kind of what it means to gaze above at the heavens through this telescope in the Atacama Desert, while at once contemplate the absolute tragedy of the people who were disappeared in the Civil War there. That was just incredible to me, how you could make something so vast and complex as history also so poetic without the aestheticization causing anything to be lost. So that film really had an effect on me, as did Agnes Varda's The Gleaners and I, for a totally different reason in terms of how you can be incredibly playful and associative while exploring these themes of what it means to tell a story and glean from the world around. So I could go on and on, but those are just two films that come to mind at the moment that had a profound impact on this journey that I feel very lucky to be on.
And what about you, Alex?
The one filmmaker that I knew growing up was Dan Fung Dennis, who made a beautiful film called Hell and Back Again. We grew up in the same small town in upstate New York, and that film made a huge impression on me. It was one of the first films that I was like, wow, holy shit, this feels like a fiction film, but it's also so layered and carrying parallel storylines at the same time. The editing was so creative. And so that made a really lasting impression on me. And then other more contemporary films like Minding the Gap really, really resonated with me. I thought, like, bringing yourself into the story in such a delicate way, and also, telling a story from that perspective with people that, you often don't hear from in cinema. I loved that film. I love Nostalgia for the Light too. It's such a beautiful film. Yeah, long list, but I'll pass it back to you.
So one of the things that I'm always very curious about is, how do you go about finding, these subjects that you end up covering? For some of you, it's several years that take up, several years of your life. How do these subjects, come about for you, where you discover them and say, okay, I want to start down this path and stick with this and tell this story over the next couple of years? I want to start with you, Alex.
For me, I reached out to Nadine. It was kind of old school. I just had read about her work, felt really, really inspired by her, and sent her an email and said, hey, I'd love to come meet you. I have no idea what this will be. I thought it would maybe be a short film about her work and this transition period with a new administration coming into Brazil. But I had done quite a bit of work as a journalist before moving into film. And so have that kind of approach. And I'd also done a lot of work in participatory film, working with lawyers and human rights activists, talking about how they can take film and incorporate it into their work as evidence, but also, sometimes as art. And so that informed a lot of my approach with this community and the way that I was thinking about constructing the film itself from those really early conversations.
And what about you, Sarah?
I think for me, there's a couple things. You're right that we just commit our lives to these stories. And so it has to be a very important decision. I have a particular interest in films that explore the human relationship with non-human nature. So I'm always looking for people who have that kind of lived experience. But most notably, I think who see the world in a profoundly different way than what I've encountered. My first film was about mushroom hunters, a Cambodian man who survived the Khmer Rouge, and a man named Roger, an American man who was a sniper in the Vietnam War. And that film tells the story of their relationship over the course of one mushroom hunt in Oregon. But their way of reading the forest taught me so much about ecology and how, as Coy, one of my protagonists, says, you have to look above in order to see below. And so I really thought of both of them as teachers of a new kind of way of sight. And that's something that Katya and Marie certainly taught me, how to see the earth differently due to their obsession with volcanoes. And my last film, This Year in the Unseen, was literally about a woman who sees spirits of nature everywhere. So that kind of way in the world is super important to me. And then I'll just share one thing that has always stuck with me and been incredibly helpful in making this decision, which is my dear friend and former collaborator, Josh Penn, who's just an epic documentary and also fiction producer. He once said that for him, a good test of if he wants to commit to a film is if he would go on a road trip with the main characters. And I just love that. It's like, that's actually really helped me to decide some things. Like, would I want to spend hours in the car with these two people? And I've made some decisions actually thinking like, no, like they are really interesting, but I don't think I want to go on a journey with them. And that's helped a lot. But I can say that I would love to, yeah, I would fly to the moon and the stretches of outer space to be with Katya and Maurice.
And how about you, Matthew?
It's funny. I have that rule similarly for crew that I work with. I have a rule like if you don't want to go to dinner with them, then you probably shouldn't be working with them. So, and I totally forgot the question. Do you mind repeating?
It's you know, how do you make the choices? You know, make your choice about what subject you're going to cover and deciding what you're going to commit, you know, all this time to.
I mean, I think it sounds cliche. It is cliched, but I think for me, the subjects always choose me. And if I look back on all the films that I've done, it's generally trying to take these large amorphous subjects: drug war in Mexico, ISIS in Syria, COVID, end of the war in Afghanistan, and trying to take these issues that are plastered across headlines and we're inundated with stats and information. They're often used as political football in Washington or capitals around the world, and trying to humanize them, trying to put a human face to them, trying to personalize them, trying to make audiences be able to relate to them by making character-driven verite docs. And that's what I love. That's what I've always been attracted to is observational filmmaking and allowing audiences to go on a journey with people and to places that they otherwise wouldn't get to see or understand.
Well, Sara, Matthew, and Alex, thank you so much for joining us for this panel. This has been fantastic. We wish you all the best over these next couple of weeks as Oscar voting is starting. And to all of our viewers, don't forget to go to Gold Derby and make your Oscar predictions and use our Gold Derby app so you can do the same thing. Everyone, thanks so much.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.